One, live.
Well, hello. Welcome back to our personality disorders channel on Therapy Cable and Facebook Live. I'm Dr. Ehsan Gharadjedaghi with Therapy Cable, and what we are going to discuss every Thursday at 5 p.m. Pacific Daytime or Standard Time are issues with personality disorders. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I'm here to help answer questions. If you guys have any comments, questions, requests, please feel free to post and send us emails or call in or just post on the live channel, and I'll be glad to answer them. So today's topic about personality disorders will be revolving around the reality that they're very difficult to treat and what it means for us, basically, and some examples how we can first of all understand the difficulty that's in place, and also how to go about it and change the characteristics and the situations, if you will, as well as treating the disorder. So we have talked in the past about the different clusters, cluster A, B, and C of personality disorders according to the DSM. And I'm not going to go through all of them before. There are other videos available. If you're interested, you can look at them and watch them or listen to a podcast as well and learn about them. But I'm just going to kind of very quickly, without giving the full description, list them and then address each one by one. So in the cluster A, which is the odd eccentric cluster, the person is, we have three, first of all, we have three personality disorders. One is the schizotypal, and the other one, also known as schizoid personality disorder, and then the paranoid personality disorder. So let's start with the paranoid. So if someone has suffering, really, and that's ultimately what I can characterize it with, is a state of suffering. Someone who has a paranoid personality, and that's remember the definition is that enduring impairment in interpersonal functioning. Then they're truly suffering from a constant anxiety around their self-protection and being more or less attacked and threatened by others, by their environment, and at times even imaginary figures. So without having a tangible evidence that someone is hurting them, without even knowing specifically who may be hurting them. So thinking about it, this particular predicament that somebody may be constantly anxious and nervous and kind of withdrawn from everyone around them, you can imagine what the suffering is like. So certainly if I was suffering from that paranoid personality, I can imagine that I would get exhausted myself. After a while, I would want to just kind of get a reprieve and escape from it. So certainly that burden itself needs to be understood. And I have worked with a few people in terms of clinical practice and even in business dealings and interpersonal relationships with people who have constantly these paranoid ideations. So number one, when we say, why is it difficult? That's an example, the paranoid, but certainly the difficulty of treating personality disorder across the board with all the categories and all the clusters. So why is it difficult to treat? First of all, let's address that. Number one, the personality is an identity, is a person's sense of kind of composing themselves, forming and shaping a presence, if you will, a psychological skin, a boundary around kind of affirming who they are, what their limitations are, what the strengths and weaknesses are, what the particular traits and characteristics in terms of their ability to present themselves in a predictable fashion, and that's the other aspect of an identity. It's a concept, a phenomenon that is understood under an enduring, long-term, consistent, persisting shape and form. The personality doesn't change overnight. The personality doesn't fluctuate from day to day. That's an integral component of understanding identity and personality. If it is called identity or personality, one of the largest reasons and characteristics why it is called identity or personality is its consistency and persistence over time, without much fluctuations. There's some flexibility to it. Person may have a leeway, if you will, or a percentage, maybe 5% of their traits and characteristics, preferences fluctuate over time a little bit from one day to the other. But overall, there's a predictability to that pattern of the way they present themselves, the way they describe themselves, the way they feel internally, the way they interact with their environment, the way they respond to their environment and the demands of the society. So then perhaps what we could discern from that and infer from it is, you could easily predict certain habits of people that you know based on your knowledge of their identity and personality, such as the way they groom themselves or dress up or drive or walk or talk or just make certain decisions or may feel in certain situations. So because of that whole definition of consistency and persistent, enduring, unaltering, non-changeable pattern of being, we can understand that any change to it is not going to come easy, right? It happens probably over many, many years. It would be slight change, and except if perhaps a person just makes a conscious choice. On the one hand, that's one of the reasons, to make a conscious choice of changing their personality based on certain epiphany or insight or learning that they obtain. And or that would be second possibility is that they would suddenly change their personality, perhaps based on trauma, some kind of traumatic event that is deeply troubling for them and really hits them into the core of their identity, and therefore there's a shift and a transformation that takes place, which leads to a change of their personality. And third option that comes to my mind would be an organic biological change. And for instance, we know from history there is a case of a guy called a railroad worker called Phineas Gage, that a person who was kind of a more or less a cordial, polite individual, and after having an accident with a iron rod going through his brain and hitting his limbic system, central area of his brain, and then he survived the blow attack, but then became a different person. His personality completely changed, became reclusive and secluded and belligerent and assaultive toward people, and basically died alone and shunned from the society. So those are at least three options that come to my mind, the reasons why a drastic personality change would take place. Otherwise, any changes would be gradual over time and really hardly discernible. And that is really the core reason and concept to understand that also dysfunctions, maladaptive presentations, maladaptive aspects of personality too are long enduring and not amiable to change and alteration immediately. When we talk about personality disorders, we're talking about such maladaptive, dysfunctional, debilitating, self-defeating almost self-destructive aspects of a person's personality. So just like with the good traits, also the bad traits are resistant to change over a shorter period of time. Now, that's one side of it. And the other one, I would say, is that idea of benefit, primary benefit, or, as well as secondary benefit, come to my mind. But generally, the idea of benefit, that any aspects of personality, whether it's good or bad, provides a benefit. So going back to that paranoid example, the paranoid personality, let's go through that. What kind of benefit could paranoia provide? So, and that is where we can gain knowledge and insight from models and theories, because the mind is really a particularly kind of sealed, it's almost hermeneutically sealed, or quite strongly sealed against our ability to assess and discern, especially because everything that occurs in our mind mostly is a product of our neurobiological interactions, neurochemical, neurobiological, neuronal interactions that for which we don't have a tool to thoroughly, exactly, and accurately to take it apart, analyze it to the, let's say, the bits of the information, and create some kind of a causality and proof for why things happen the way they do in our mind, and as a result, why we make certain decisions or feel certain way or think certain way or take certain action. So because of our lack of really just measurement tools, assessment tools, inference tools, analysis tools, and ability to make it concrete and tangible, we have to rely on a lot of theoretical models as means of inference. So rather than being able to more or less what is called in the scientific methodology as a very kind of a hard science or hard facts, where we can easily take molecules, let's say, apart and create a causal relationship that can provide us with almost 100% reliability and validity and have proof in front of us. We can't do that with our thoughts and brain and neurochemical interaction. So what we would have to do is make certain assumptions, hypotheses. Those are called the models that we come from, and then based on predictions, more or less, make certain inferences and conclusions. So when it comes to, let's say, paranoid personality, there are some models that would explain why a person would have even developed a paranoia and this self-protective, if you will, accusation, displeasure, perception of threat in the first place. And ultimately, the understanding here is that the paranoia serves a purpose. And more or less, it is also, especially from a psychodynamic perspective, regarded as a defense mechanism for this person, albeit a kind of a less ideal defense mechanism. But it is better than not having any defense mechanisms in the first place. Now, it may have formed based on lots of different factors that I don't want to get into right now in this live session, unless a person is, some of you who are highly interested to hear that, and we can get into it, or we can also do a phone consultation, because it's not interesting for everyone to hear. But ultimately, the commonality between all these personality disorders, as well as our interest, everybody who's listening and watching this and wants to find out what's ultimately common among them, is the fact that these defense mechanisms, these ways of dealing with the realities of our lives, especially the underlying anxiety, has a certain benefit. So it has provided, most likely, it has provided the person who is struggling with the paranoia with a benefit. And we can imagine some of those benefits, what they could be. If you think about it, just kind of common sense, why would suspicion be a benefit. If someone has suspicion, well, we can understand that generally suspicion has lots of benefits. If we didn't have the ability to suspect, to become suspicious, to carry some suspicion around certain situations, certain people, certain intentions, certain dealings, business dealings, personal dealings, we lower our guard generally. If we don't have suspicion, we have lowered our guard, we have increased our trust in that person or situation, and therefore we would be more vulnerable to any unforeseen attacks, if you will. So suspicion generally can serve many of us, and in fact, I would say there's no human being who doesn't utilize a suspicious assessment of situations on a daily basis. We become suspicious more or less automatically about lots of things. For instance, if you go into a shop and you want to purchase something, you may be a little bit suspicious in terms of how much they charge. If the salesperson is trying to pull one over you, cheat you out of certain benefits, charge more, deliver less. We become suspicious if maybe even the police officer, stops us on the street in terms of what do they want, what did I do wrong. If we didn't, we may jump to conclusions such as, let's say, assuming that we are being discriminated against. We become suspicious if our, let's say, loved one and partner in life, romantic partner, acts in a certain unpredictable and atypical way, such as like they were supposed to answer their phone and they don't answer it. They were supposed to be in a place and they're not in that place. We become suspicious about business dealings and relationships, business relationships, partnerships, if we notice that maybe there is a certain benefit at stake, such as monetary or other types of benefits that we may be afraid our partner may want more, because all of us as human beings, we're very familiar with the concept of greed. At times we ourselves become greedy about certain things and may want more than others. So if you think about this, a suspicion generally is a human characteristic, is a skill, is a level of awareness and discernment that generally is very useful. And we all engage in that on a daily basis. There are tons of examples. I'm not going to go through them, right? You all have your own examples. So, however, in case of paranoid personality, it seems like this suspicion pattern is in overdrive. It is indiscriminate. It is across the board. It is constant. It's relentless. It is, at times, in fact, oftentimes, without merit, without a good reason, without clear evidence. It's fraught with almost, kind of fabricated, or seemingly at least fabricated assumptions and speculations, and also a presentation of a paranoid personality, a person with paranoid personality that is overly obsessed about the situation and highly resistant, and again that self-protectiveness kicks in, where it's very difficult to actually connect with them, sit down with them, gain their trust, and really convince them otherwise in terms of contrary to their beliefs. It may take months or years of collecting information and helping them really create this causality that their assumptions have actually been more or less anxiety-driven and without merit, without a good foundation in terms of evidentiary reality, and that there is a lot more evidence contrary to their beliefs, which, by the way, bring new benefits. So here the discussion changes, I would say, from why are they so hard to treat to, how can we treat them, especially in this case that we are talking about paranoid personality. Well, the idea here would be to replace that benefit of suspicion with benefit of trust, right? And basically, what we could do is help a person to gradually gain and collect these pieces of evidence of trust that are irrefutable, that are solid, and really kind of, even if it may be very, very small, collect this, if you will, this jar or this purse, this little kind of a carry-on, if you will, of ability to trust at least one situation or at least one person, and create that solid foundation upon which they can put the rest of their days, the rest of the situations, the rest of the people, and build up from there. So teaching them that is actually beneficial in their own sense of self-protection, that they can definitely protect and take care of themselves even more if they have that solid, foolproof, highly reliable connection, whether it is with a person or a situation that they can heavily rely on, 100% rely on. And then gradually, over time, this person can learn that this benefit of being able to trust, being able to develop reliable relationships, and based on evidence, collecting evidence, and supporting that experience of trust is much more valuable than just kind of going around being afraid of anybody and everything, and collapsing and isolating themselves. So now, moving forward, we can also go through some of these other personality disorders. And by the way, if you have any questions, if anything comes up, feel free to just text or type in your information. Don't worry about interrupting. We will get to your questions and answer those questions. And also, if you have suggestions, please feel free to post those on our channel. So, with schizotypal, where we have talked about a person who has odd eccentric behavior and mostly also a desire to connect people, but really they're due to a lot of some hallucinations and delusions that they have, they lack the skill of interpersonal effectiveness, of an effective way of communicating and relating to others. They're missing out on more or less a normal social code or script to know how to act and behave with other people. And you could say that they are perhaps missing a certain buffer. Generally, most people, they have their psychological skin is thick enough, let's say, to provide this buffer between their personal self and their public self. So let's say they may not necessarily easily share some of their likes and dislikes and preferences. They may keep it quiet, and by sharing, I mean it could be by the way they dress themselves, by the way they behave in terms of reaction to certain stimuli, the way they laugh or express their opinions, or the let's say jokes, if you will, or concepts that they find interesting or uninteresting, the way they approach people and withdraw from people. Generally, we have a range of acceptable behaviors, such as, let's say, if you normal person, more or less, or a person without schizotypal tendencies, they would enter a room, they would have a certain code of conduct to follow, which generally is acceptable, such as, let's say, greeting the people in the room, shaking hands, or acknowledging certain individuals, looking for a certain chair, table, position to join the group in a very much confirmatory or conforming manner where they kind of fit in. So the social code and script they're following has multiple options available for them to choose and easily fit in that type of an environment. It could be by adjusting their tone, their voice, their language, their level of being animated, their emotional expression, their thoughts, even topics that they choose, such as if the person comes in and sees his or her friend at a bar, and the way they're, let's say they're watching the sports channel, and the way they're reacting to that, they easily may match that group think and group dynamics and group behavior. Then, so versus a person with a schizotypal personality, they may miss out on this and may have a hard time on matching these norms and codes and scripts and clues, and basically act out of character or act out of order or act out of norm. So they make themselves more noticeable, they stand out. There's a conflict between the way they think they should be behaving and expressing and interacting with others, and the way the expectation from that norm remains within the group and is presented against this person with schizotypal personality. So out of that clash and discrepancy, then further anxiety is created, which again leads the person to feel even more awkward and invalidated, misunderstood, unacknowledged, and vice versa, for the group to sense a certain a certain mismatch of the social codes and norms, and then again kind of react to it maybe negatively, perhaps wanting to leave the group, perhaps wanting to end the conversation, and the situation becomes even more awkward. So in this case, when a person with this schizotypal behaviors, is struggling with that type of a personality, it has benefited them. And again, it's hard to believe that this type of a presentation is actually beneficial. Certainly over long term, it is not. But what I can see here, I can suggest, is that there is the ability of genuinely being oneself, regardless of social norms. That's actually, if you think about it, most people would have a hard time to annul or overcome social norms, ignore social norms, because that would lead to a certain sense of embarrassment and other guilt that a person has chosen to ignore and blatantly kind of overrule certain social norms and present themselves awkwardly. So with that in mind, that understanding is that basically what we have is a person who is genuinely themselves, despite the social norms. So it takes a lot of guts, a lot of courage to go against the grain, so to say, and just kind of experiment with the situation. And perhaps that is the real benefit in terms of allowing, kind of reducing their guard and thinning their social skin and thinning that buffer to the extent that they are willing to experiment with these clashes, with this conflict, with more or less a lot of trials and errors of trying to match the inside with the outside. So, and so the benefit, I would say, is more or less self-assertiveness. However, apparently what is missing here is a sense of self-observation and self-monitoring, to a point that the teachable lesson can lead to a better fit within the society, and as a result kind of getting the secondary benefits, the greater benefits of sense of belonging, attachment, functional relationships, more support from others, more inclusion, more other types of benefits, if you will. For instance, somebody who would enjoy to be in relationship with you, and actually kind of also, again, goes back to that idea of what is personality and identity, that a person who chooses to be in relationship with you can predict and rely on the fact that they are dealing with someone that is not erratically changing over time. So we really need that as human beings. If you think about it, we are in need of the predictability and consistency, because that allows us to relax a little bit in face of this constant change. As they say, change is inevitable, meaning that the whole world is full of change. We are faced with this constant flux of changes taking place throughout the day. And certainly, this whole change goes back to that, if you will, original change or cycle that we naturally experience, which is more or less our diurnal cycle, 12 hours. Constant change that we experience day and night, day and night. And then throughout the day, people changes and interactions with people. People move in and move out of our personal space. We experience and face tons of demands and expectations throughout the entire day and night, if you're awake, depending on what cycle we're more or less what our shift is. Some people work throughout the night and sleep during the day hours. So, but because we are presented as a conscious, awake person, we are presented with constant change, and ultimately having the ability to predict the outcome and the next day or the next more or less set of timelines in the future would bode well for us. We would benefit from that heavily, because we would know that what is coming our way. We can prepare for bad times. We can more or less bet on good times, and change and adapt our strategies to again safeguard our survivability and our vitality. So. And then, like we said, the person with schizotypal personality characteristics, they can only really benefit from this change of wanting to improve as far as the concept of fitting in a community is involved. If they understand that, being consistent, respecting that psychological skin, that appreciating that buffer, separating the inner self from the outer presentation and self, learning about this code of conduct within the community can be very beneficial for this person, as it would ultimately lead to a more predictable, consistent kind of a supply of benefits, including better relationships, better opportunities, and a greater satisfaction and gratification from life. And lastly, in this cluster A category, we are dealing with schizoid personality disorder, or schizoid personality disorder. So with the schizoid personality, what we have is very briefly stated, no desire to really interact with others and belong to a community or a group, or be close to others or form attachments. And however, so basically kind of a sense of isolation and a tendency to stay away from people and individuals. And again, what we can imagine the benefit to be in the multiple models that can explain those benefits and how they may have developed, but ultimately there has been a survival value to getting this person kind of survive bad times and go through their life and upbringing by simply isolating themselves. Maybe that isolation and seclusion has provided them with some kind of a protection, peacefulness, ability to self-regulate their anxieties and their own self, like the demand of existence, which is also very important to point out. In fact, there is a whole theory of existentialism that deals with this, what we call generally existential anxiety. In fact, when it blows up, existential anxiety becomes more of an existential terror, and that's a concept, very well-known concept in both philosophical as well as psychological discourse about the fact that we as human beings are challenged existentially, as we always have to deal with certain uncertainty that we can never get to a closure. We can never close this chapter of uncertainty in terms of existentially, why do we even exist? Nobody can really answer that. Where we come from and where we are going. We're basically putting a meaning and purposefulness and thorough understanding to the phenomenon of existence. We know we exist. We know we have a more or less certain unique identity and entity that has a freedom of moving around and interacting with its environment in a very highly intellectual and intelligent manner. But we really don't know much more than that in terms of why it exists in the first place and who has created it, and ultimately what it is supposed to provide us with. And therefore it creates a sense of confusion and kind of a added worries and anxieties, more or less, if we are aligned with what we are supposed to be aligned with. Because there is no guideline, a guidebook, if you will, a manual that is universally acceptable. Certainly, all kinds of cultures and groups and sects and sets or groups of people come up with different, again, theories and possibilities and hypotheses. And again, those models are also supposed to reduce our level of anxiety toward this unknown, to explain our existence, to explain our situation, to explain our moment-to-moment self-reflection, actually. And so that is technically something that, because every human being really has to come to terms with, ultimately based on their strengths and weaknesses, the unique characteristics of their original and basic development from birth to death. Ultimately, they have to develop certain coping mechanisms around management of this unknown, of the anxiety. So in this case, again, going back to personality disorders that we have discussed, some people may have created this overly active, obsessive, and a lot of more or less compulsive, obsessive-compulsive type of coping skills that we mentioned, that they have now internalized and integrated as part of their way of explaining themselves and the world around them, and strike a balance, negotiated a more or less a status quo. Some of it is outside of their awareness, some of it is within, and some of it is explainable to them and to others, and some of it is not. And that's where more or less that struggle lies. So we discussed these particular struggles for cluster A. And so lastly, before I go to struggle, basically cluster B and cluster C, I want to again bring up the opportunity of asking any questions you may have, and again reminding everyone that from 5 to 6 p.m. Every Thursday, and that is 5 to 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, We are live, and you can ask questions, and we are here to answer them. And if you have suggestions, let us know. We'll come up with topics that suit your needs. So now going forward again with the personality disorders, and again finding some solutions for cluster B and C very quickly. For cluster C, we have antisocial, histrionic, borderline, and narcissistic personality disorder. So with antisocial, there is that, very briefly stated, that sense of ignoring authority, rebelling against norms, rules, regulations, and kind of overruling them. Especially people who can't really have deep remorse. They do not sense anything similar to empathy or sympathy for other people's plight. So a very self-centered, selfish, self-oriented type of a focus on getting taking advantage of life in whatever shape or form, and adamantly fighting against rules and limitations, regulations that they dislike. So the benefit, certainly, you can understand the benefit, right? Generally, there is an immediate benefit for a person to get what they need, one way or another, to not be confined by these rules and norms that exist around them and that apply to more or less the majority of the society. That's the immediate benefit they're getting. Now, they haven't necessarily incorporated that strategy in a way that would not backfire. So ultimately, getting the immediate benefit by overruling and overlooking and blatantly ignoring norms and rules ultimately leads to coercion, basically more or less a coercive backlash from the society that would put them in place and basically by force limit their ability to do further damage. And that is something that they haven't particularly incorporated or managed to weave into a long-term plan. So they end up, suffering as well. They end up mostly incarcerated and in clashes with the executive branch, if you will, of the community and society, being the police officers, probation officers, military, highway patrol, you name it, just kind of the more generally known as police force. And now, the way out certainly would be to see the greater picture, that relenting on this need to get immediately gratified is beneficial, because generally, even though they may not get what they want in the short term, if they actually play ball and if they actually master more or less the ability to deal with those restrictions and learn how to perhaps bend or extend or change those restrictions over time in a fashion that it can have a reciprocal and mutual benefit to both them and the group around them or people around them in society, then actually they would really benefit deeply and extremely from having negotiated that type of a strategy on the long term. So that would be really the way of helping the person with antisocial personality disorder. With narcissistic, it is, and by the way, again, these are all very challenging because of what we mentioned, that particularly any of these coping skills and part of personality characteristics have provided useful benefit over the course of their development. So maybe let's say, for instance, a narcissist usually finds someone who is basically kind of a dependent person and or someone with low self-esteem to complement their high grandiose view and perspective of their own self and their value. Therefore, ultimately they have been catered to. People with narcissistic personality characteristics, they have one way or another found a matching partner or family member or acquaintance or friend or you name it, just another human being, to cater to them, to serve them, to provide them with what they needed in that moment again, whether it was fame or money or power or position or some other types of benefits, sexual, sensual, emotional, or even kind of validation, recognition, and so forth. So this is one of the most difficult, most resistant personality traits to change, very specifically due to the fact that the reward that they're getting from other people really giving them what they want becomes self-perpetuating. It's very much an unbreakable cycle. It's extremely difficult to take apart, and really to make the person with narcissistic personality disorder aware of the parallel damage, of the concurrent damage that they are doing to themselves and others. Because again, a lot of the benefits and goodies that they're getting in the short term feel good. However, over time, they're also establishing a destructive pattern of creating the relationships that ultimately don't last. And so no matter how long they do last, it could be anywhere from a few hours to decades, ultimately they fail. Because bottom line, the human nature of the person who is has no self-esteem or catering and becomes dependent, ultimately gets to a very low point where this person either chooses to cease to exist, more or less commit suicide if they continue remaining in that relationship, or they choose to leave, because ultimately absolutely there is defined that there is absolutely no benefit for them by remaining in that relationship. So they choose to leave the relationship to be free from the yoke, from the assault, from the abusive nature of the relationship with the narcissist, because more or less a narcissist ultimately treats everyone in their lives as extended objects that they can use, abuse, and take advantage of. So there's an inherent imbalance in terms of valuation. A person who is dependent or has no self-esteem does not get valued, will not feel valued, and all the values and appreciation has to be channeled toward the person with narcissism, and it becomes a very draining and exhaustive proposition that can not last over time. So on the long term, people with narcissistic personalities end up losing. They have gained a lot in terms of admiration and validity and validation and positive responses and rewards for a few years, but the series of failed losses and relationships over time and the failures that they experience, they accumulate and amount to very much a very sad, depressive, self-defeating, self-deprecating state of and loneliness, because nobody wants to be around people with narcissistic features anymore. So we are at 5:51 right now. There's another 5-6 minutes that we will continue. I would like to just wrap up with the cluster B, and then we will leave cluster C for next week. So the cluster B, we have 2 more to go, which is the borderline personality and histrionic. So with borderline personality, if you think about it, we have the idea of fear of rejection and emotional dysregulation around that sense of anticipation of fear of rejection, and this vacillation between going, two polar opposites of feeling highly valued and feeling extremely devalued, as well as highly admiring another person and then switching to a sense of belittling and devaluing the other person. So this experience that the person with borderline personality has in terms of their self-esteem and ability to regulate the intense feelings and emotions they get in when they're engaged in that type of a very much dichotomous black and white observation, assessment, and thinking and feeling with other people, is that that whole experience and engagement escalates to a point of really just hurting themselves and others, and again, ultimately leading to very dysfunctional relationships, highly intense, but a lot of times fraught with violence or assault or some sense of self-destruction and destruction of others. So, and basically, again, another exhaustive, dramatic, and draining type of a interaction with other individuals. So the benefit usually that they are experiencing from this type of engagement is really the intense drama and more or less feeling alive, feeling some kind of a righteousness, some kind of a, again, value like that, because they're taking things so seriously and they're extremely vested in certain ideology, if you will, and more or less attempt and commit, dedicate their lives to being or experiencing relationships in this way. They more or less feel alive, if you will, and certainly the other benefit would be, if you will, what I would consider a coping skill that perhaps matches their predisposition. Perhaps there is a genetic component, and there are some studies that show certainly many of these personality disorders can be very much genetically, at least to a great extent, 30-40% genetically predisposed. So there's a match between the way they internally feel that they should be coping again with anxieties of relationships and this particular coping style that they have acquired, and at times, feeling chemically, hormonally, biologically in tune with this type of a lifestyle, where they, at one point of time, they are in seventh heaven or in the clouds and feel extremely valued, extremely energetic and ecstatic about life, and other times, this deep, grave depth of sorrow and disappointment, disillusionment, anger, lack of appreciation, and rejection, that ultimately is a pain they can endure more or less, and weather. They weather through that storm and come out after a while again on the other polar opposite. So now, how do we help with this individual? We have talked about that in the past, and also there's another video on that where they created. But generally, just really helping the person with seeing a benefit in a different lifestyle. A more peaceful, a more gradual, a more manageable, a more contained and containable and content way of dealing with anxieties. Kind of taking life less seriously, managing these assumptions and anticipations of rejection and evaluation in a much better, much mellower way, and allowing time and kind of consistency and the reliability in the relationship to win versus the fears of possible detachment or separation. And it happens. We know that also biologically, in terms of chronological age, borderline personality disorder is kind of diminishes after age of 35. So mid-30s, late 30s, people who have had signs of borderline personality in their early teens, adulthood, early or late adulthood, they kind of relent and they exhibit less of these signs over time at the age of after age of the late 30s, perhaps early 40s or 50s. So lastly, histrionic is that particular personality that relies heavily on being in the center of attention, especially in a very sexualized manner. And again, the benefit certainly is to get rewards from the attention that the person getting from others at the expense of, again, kind of repeating this over and over again and perhaps breaking up one relationship and going into another relationship. Feeling or kind of making people feel manipulated by their overly sexual presence and kind of wooing and luring people into their den, if you will, and then acting out on those anxieties of the game, perhaps not being appreciated or fear of rejection or not getting what they want in an extreme way, and which we know as a dramatic way. The whole four categories we mentioned fall into the cluster B, which is known as dramatic way. And if we can notice that all of them kind of thrive on drama, that notion of getting this sensation and reward from experiencing this drama. Again, we can help a person to see that there is a better alternative, non-dramatic alternative that ultimately pays off, even though at times it may be a little bit boring, but it is less disruptive, it's more reliable, more predictable, more secure. It leads to more security in a person, both in themselves as well as experiencing the security in their relationship. So to wrap up, this was our discussion of personality disorders and why they are hard to treat, and some opportunities and options as to how we can treat the cluster A and B. Next time we will just wrap up next Thursday, 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. We will wrap up cluster C and go into some other questions that you may have. Feel free to email us, text us, post, and that way we can provide a list of options and answers. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful beginning of November. It's November 2nd. Have a wonderful evening. Take care.